Well, hi, Cascade Church. Welcome to another Wednesday Word. This week we've gotten into some interesting things. In the Old Testament, we've gotten to Mount Sinai, where we get the law. And in the New Testament, we're in the Garden of Gethsemane. So some of the more iconic parts of the Bible happening. And don't forget, we've also got Psalms and Proverbs. I don't talk about those as much, but they're beautiful. This week in Psalm 30, one of my favorites, how God turns our mourning into dancing. It's just a great way how God so emotionally, honestly takes us in our grief. I think a lot of people think Christians don't grieve, that we're not supposed to feel negative emotions and be happy all the time. But the Beatitudes are about being blessed when you mourn, when you're weeping. They're not be happy attitudes like Robert Schuller said. We're not supposed to be happy. We're supposed to be joyful and blessed, and that's deeper and harder. And I love the Bible's emotional honesty. So on Mount Sinai in Exodus, we get the 10 Commandments, and that's the law that begins to shape how human relationships happen. And for us, the 10 Commandments seem so common sense. Don't commit adultery, don't bear false witness, don't murder. But back in those days, this was the beginning of beginning of civilization. So you have a whole group of refugees in the desert wandering around, being harassed on all sides by enemies. They're beginning to set up one of the most moral and ethical codes of relating with each other that the world has ever seen and that we still look to today over 4,000 years later. So there's some wisdom happening here. So don't get distracted by all the blood on the earlobe stuff. Instead, focus on what's going on. One of the things that really gets into me, and I'm starting to do more research. I just bought a book called Reading While Black that takes a really deep look at the biblical view of slavery versus what happened in America. So hopefully more on this to come. But you hear laws about slavery. And as an American, my reaction is, how could there be any slaves? But if you try to listen to it, this is a group of people who've been slaves for 400 years, so almost twice as long as America's ever existed. And the laws about slavery aren't saying make sure you have slaves. In fact, you can argue, and I'm doing more research on this, but you can argue that God doesn't endorse slavery, he just admits that it happens. So what you hear instead is, if you've had a slave for 7 years, set him free. If your slave has a kid, set it free. And so you're seeing options out of slavery, ways that slaves can get married, so that slaves can have regular lives, that if you beat a slave and he loses an eye or a tooth, the American reaction to that is, how dare you beat a slave or beat anybody that they would lose an eye or a tooth? But you put yourself in a context where that was common. If you beat a slave and he loses a tooth or an eye, they go free immediately. And so while it's so easy to read the injustice around this, look for those signs of grace, the signs that God's moving forward to a place where humanity can understand that all slavery is wrong. Remember, the people who fought for emancipation weren't people who rejected the Bible. They were people who held the Bible closest, the Quakers, the men of faith who would say, based on the Word of God, the fact that we're all created in the image of God, then we can't treat anyone like this. And so read the Bible completely and try to read it in its original context. One of the things that you see is how the priesthood is set up. And when I remember the first time I read through the Old Testament, how fascinated I was by the priests. Growing up, I always pictured the priest as the weak ones, the ones who were kind of put to the margins. Maybe I had bad role models or just bad TV. Father Mulcahy from MASH, he was kind of, at times he could be strong, but usually he was just comic relief, a little mealy mouth. And that's how I pictured the priesthood. But the priests here were strong. Levi was the first one who started them. And so he was the one who went and fought and protected the honor of his sister and slaughtered a whole city. Got a little judged for that. Later, we're going to see that there's a big rebellion against Moses, and the Levites marched back and forth through the camp, killing people to set them apart for God. They were the only ones willing to pick up the sword to follow God. And so we see more of a warrior caste, not just a weak caste. As the high priest is set up, one of my seminary professors mentioned, and you don't picture it necessarily when you're reading it, but all the blues and velvets and such, his whole outfit would reflect the cosmos, where his turban was purple like the nighttime sky, then get lighter blue, and then brighter colors, almost like a sunset. And the image there is he stands as a human bridge between man and heaven. The old word you might have heard in books or movies, pontifex, is what they used to call priests. And that's a Latin word called bridge. And so if you picture the priest as a bridge between man and God, then the high priest is the one that would take everybody from this world into the presence of God. and the way he was dressed reflected that. He would have on his shoulders 2 onyxes, so 2 black stones that had the names of the tribes in them. On his chest, he would have the ephod, where there's an Urim and Thummim for making decisions, but also stones for each of the tribes of Israel. And so he would walk into the presence of God with Israel's names written on his shoulders, that he would carry that, and on his heart, meaning he loved them. So if Jesus is our great high priest, it means that he carries us to God, and we're over his heart when it comes to making decisions, when it comes to advocating for us and praying for us in God's presence. It says in the book of Hebrews that we have a great high priest who's seated at God's right hand. No more sacrifices needed, and he prays for you daily. The only time he stands is when he's advocating for us. At the trial of Stephen, where Stephen's being persecuted, where he's being falsely accused, when he's being stoned to death, he sees Jesus standing at God's right hand, pleading for him, saying, "That's my servant." So that's our high priest. So everywhere through the Old Testament, you see how the high priest is set apart. One of the weird things is you see how the priest is consecrated. They take blood and they put it on his earlobe, on his thumb, and on his toe. You might be wondering why, and there's 2 reasons really. The priestly garments were so covering that there wasn't a lot of exposed flesh left. And so you'd take the toe, the thumb, and the earlobe. You're saying that from head to the ends of your fingers to your toes, all of that is consecrated to God. So it's kind of marking out the borders, saying this entire person is covered by God, or consecrated to God, covered by the blood. So there's lots of details. If you have any questions about those laws, feel free to reach out to me. It's impossible to go through all of them, or we'd be here for hours. In the New Testament, we see Jesus ending up in the Garden of Gethsemane. And through that, he begins judging the Pharisees, calling them whitewashed tombs. And one of the phrases he says to that, and this is what's stirring the Pharisees to want to kill him, is he says, "You are the ones who said that if the prophets had spoken to you, you would have listened." And it's really easy for me to write off the Pharisees. I would never be like that. But when I hear that one, I had a pause. Because I wonder, would I have listened to the prophets when I had the chance? It's easy today to look down on slave holders and people who were kind of on the wrong side of history. But would we have done any better? I hope so, but to say definitely that you would have been smarter and more moral than Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or Thomas Jefferson. There's a lot of pride there. And so we have to humble ourselves and say, Lord, I hope I wouldn't have been a slaveholder. I hope I would have been an abolitionist. I hope I would have supported what you wanted to do. But without pride, we can't necessarily know that. So instead, we humble ourselves and say, there, but by the grace of God, I go. The Pharisees weren't able to do that. And instead, when Jesus said that, that provoked them to want to kill him. And so he begins to talk about the destruction of the temple, saying, the disciples, as they're walking through Jerusalem, say, "Isn't this temple beautiful?" And he says, "Truly I tell you that not one stone is going to remain." And he begins to talk about end times, but there's a short-term fulfillment. In 70 AD, Titus, a Roman general, who becomes emperor, I believe, begins to lay siege to Jerusalem and tears the temple down. And it is still torn down. It has not been rebuilt since 70 AD. So almost 2,000 years there's been destruction, and all of that was predicted by Jesus. He begins to talk about wars and rumors of wars, and commentators debate whether this stuff is all being fulfilled in 70 AD or if it's at the end of time. I think there's parts that are both. And one of the phrases that really stands out is Jesus says, "I don't even know when this was going to happen. Even the Son of Man does not know the time or the coming." And I remember really vividly, we're in seminary, senior year, so the 3rd year of seminary, about to graduate, and we're in theology class with R.C. Sproul. And somebody asks him, the discussion is on how Jesus is fully God and fully human. And they ask, how does Jesus not know the time of his coming if he's fully God? And R.C. Sproul says, I don't answer that at an undergraduate level. No, we're not at an undergraduate level. So what he was really saying is, I don't know off the top of my head. It took a lot of research. And so we all ran to our books. The next class we said, listen, we're not undergrads. And he says, yeah, but it's a tough question, and my goal is to teach you to learn. And the answer I've come up with is that Jesus is willingly holding back his knowledge. It says in the book of Philippians that he emptied himself of all things that he was able to hold on to, becoming nothing, becoming the nature of a servant. And so in the incarnation, even though Jesus is fully God, he's also fully human. That's why Luke said he could grow in wisdom and in stature. And so even though he, in his divine sense, knew everything, in the human world, he, by his own choice, grew and didn't know things. And honestly, I think this is for our benefit. If Jesus had said, you know what, in the year 2552, I'm coming back, and this is how, and here's all the details, Christians for 1,000 years or so would have been building bunkers and bracing themselves and getting ready for that day. And there's some that do that, instead of doing what we're called to do, of bringing God's presence and God's grace to this world. And so I think it's a gift to us that Jesus chose not to know that. But it's a big question, because Jesus is all-knowing, but it doesn't mean that he constantly flexed that all-knowing muscle while he was here on earth. At the end, we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so next week, we're going to be able to talk about the first time we see the resurrection, the death, the suffering of our Savior. People have argued that the Gospels are really long crucifixion stories with long introductions, and I believe that most of the focus of the New Testament is on the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And so we'll get into that next week. There's a lot of things in the email that comes with this or on the website, so feel free to look at those. I don't expect you to read everything I put out, but hopefully there's enough that there's resources. If you have any other questions, reach out to me. God bless, and I love you.